Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name's Scyushi and we are back in more Trove, and today I wanted to talk about the Shadow Hunter. Namely, I wanted to clarify a few things because lately I've been getting a lot of questions about Shadow Hunter's viability for the Endgame, and I know that I kind of clickbaited a little bit talking about how this class is worthless with the latest update which added the Mystic Gems. That's not entirely true. You can still use Shadow Hunter. In fact, you can still pretty much use every class in the game. Granted, you kind of are just going to be faster and better and more efficient with certain other classes. But I would always be a huge advocate for the fact that you should play the class that you enjoy rather than being a meta slave. Now, in regards to the end game in particular, that's where things start getting a bit more tricky. Like in the D15 worlds, and in particular the depths and the kraken portal. That's where Shadow Hunter starts becoming a little bit iffy. And I'll have other videos that'll talk about all the classes and so on as I slowly end up experiencing all of them. In particular, I know a lot of you have been asking me about Bard, which I might have already played up to this point. But today's video is focusing on Shadow Hunter specifically. Now, what I want to clarify, all of the other worlds, everything pretty much up to D14, do whatever you want. Go crazy. Use whatever class you totally want to. It's perfectly viable. There's no problems using Shadow Hunter, for example, up to D14. Where Shadow Hunter starts to become problematic in particular isn't even with D15. That's right, if I took all of the stuff that I currently, at the moment of recording this video, have on Solarian and swapped it back to my Shadow Hunter, I would be perfectly fine in D15 Long Shade, whether it be any of the elemental worlds. And in fact, Shadow Hunter is still a very good speed farmer. I don't have any of my gear on him right now, but when you roll, you end up getting a movement speed boost, and I could get like over 200 movement speed or something ridiculous on him. So it definitely is a very, very speedy character. And that's where I would argue previously to this update, he was the best all around character because he was decent as a boss killer, but he was really, really good at speed farming. And more particularly because Shadow Hunter can shoot through walls, he was very efficient at speed running dungeons. Now, problems start to set in when you get to D15 because the D15 dungeons in particular they're powerful. The enemies in there are kind of leaning into the field of, oh, this is like fighting like a Leviathan or going through a delve. These enemies take a long time to die. And the biggest problem with Shadow Hunter in particular in that field is when you get to a Cursed Skull, because the Shadow Hunter doesn't have an effective way of dealing with a group of enemies. There's his ultimate, which is still very broken, and there's his trap. But his trap doesn't really deal that much damage. It does freeze the enemies, which is nice, but the problem is that the Shadow Hunter is kind of a single target guy. And so he starts to have problems with the D15 dungeons. He's not entirely useless. Again, I could just use him right now and I would be fine. But granted, that's because I have like really high level gems that I'm just using on other classes right now because I'm experimenting. Where Shadow Hunter becomes worthless is in fact in the deep depths and fighting Kraken boss, because the problem is beyond the class just being single target, which means that he's an okay boss killer. He's not good for groups, which depths, spoiler alert, needs to be a class that can handle groups very efficiently. On top of that, the block stat. The block stat is the big thing that holds back a lot of the classes in the game right now when it comes to the end game. Ironically, when you're in D15, you'll have life leech out of the skill tree, and that's already enough to keep most classes alive, and you can still kind of just use death defying or even swap off death defying because you're just gonna have so much life steal and the enemies don't deal that much damage in D15. It's more so how much damage are you dealing, how quickly are you getting through the dungeons, and in particular when you get into the delves, that's where this class really falls off of a cliff because he not only doesn't have enough block to sustain himself, but because you're fighting multiple enemies, he's just kind of worthless. And it's a shame because I love Shadowhunter. He's my favorite class in the game. But there's a silver lining there. I like the idea that I can start experimenting with all the different classes and kind of going through all of them. If you end up just taking all of your Shadowhunter gear at the end game, you just take all of your gear, take all of your gems, swap it to Boomeranger or even Solarian, you're just going to be able to do a lot better. Boomer in most cases will be the better option of the two because Solarian is really powerful, probably the hardest hitting class in the entire game, even over Boomer. And I know Boomer mains will get mad at me for saying that. But suffice to say, when you have Solarian and all the cards line up and all of your abilities actually hit enemies because he's a little bit glitchy, everything just bang, bang, dead, dead, dead. Like he piles on the bodies like crazy. Boomer, on the other hand, takes a couple swings, but it's a negligible difference. The main thing with Boomer, however, is that he's consistent. That's the big thing. He's very, very consistent. He's not the fastest class, but neither is Solarian. The funny thing is that while you could just take all of your gear off Shadowhunter and put it on Boomer, in most cases, I would actually recommend using a sword on Boomer instead of the bow. Now, we're getting into other territory with this video, but I figure I should end up having a follow through with this, just because a lot of you might be a Shadowhunter main and you're wondering why is it not doing so hot at the end game, and why would you end up using the sword instead? Well, when you're using the Boomeranger and you're using Bach Bomb in particular, you have heaps of damage, but it suffers from the same or similar problems as the Shadowhunter in that you are mostly single target. Now, Bach Bomb will have the arrows kind of explode and damage enemies in an area. And for the most part, Boomeranger's got a lot of abilities that are really good for hitting a lot of enemies around you. But despite the fact that Bach Bomb is like the better option, I still would recommend the sword with the Cyclone ability because it's going to pull enemies in. And that's kind of one of the big problems with a lot of these classes at the end game that I think the developers kind of overlooked is as they made the end game enemies so spongy, it means that they wander away from us while we're attacking them because Trove's had this continual problem for years. Those of you that are new to the game have probably noticed ranged enemies suck. Because what they'll do is they'll slowly strafe around you in a circle. That's the limit of their AI. That's it. And so what happens when you have a room of those guys? Well, now they're all just wandering all over the place. Not to mention player knockback is still a thing. Not enemies knocking us back, which Lord forbid they would ever remove that from the game. But players knocking enemies back, oh, it sucks. Oh, it sucks so much. It makes it so that dungeons are so infuriating. And it's one of the biggest problems with Boomer right now, because if you end up using, I think it's his ultimate, it has a random chance of having a bunch of bombs spawn, which will end up knocking enemies all over the place. You know what would be a good solution that would fix all of this and make every class like a lot more viable, even including Shadowhunter, is if we could use our Vac-O-Matic in Prime Worlds. Like in normal Uber worlds. Oh my God, what I would give for that. Because I mean, let's be real. We don't really need build mode in Prime Worlds anymore. Like even including like the laser, like we've got a laser when we end up using our Vac-O-Matic, like when we use our delve thing, right? And I just personally think that would then make the delve caves feel like so much more like meaningful, because now suddenly it would affect like everything in the game, not just specifically delves later on. But anyways, now I'm rambling. Suffice to say, Shadowhunter is by no means worthless, but he's also not perfect. And a lot of other characters in the game just deal with the end game a lot better. In particular, a lot of the physical classes have become front and center with this update because of that blocking stat. However, and I want to really hammer this home, this is most of all coming from people that are at the end game and dealing with the delves at the same time as D15. Like I want to have one class that I'm staying on rather than swapping my gems all the time. But if you've got the extra gems, you could end up just having your Shadowhunter for Prime Worlds or Elemental Worlds, and then just your Boomeranger when you go into the delves. Or if you don't mind swapping your gems all the time, yeah, just do that. This is most of all just because of the naysayers of, people coming in and going, oh man, really? Shadowhunter sucks. I can't use him anymore. No, you can use him. You can use any class in the game up to a point. It's just when you end up getting into the delves, you need to have combat block because those enemies are going to be hitting your entire health bar every single tick of damage.